So, I've said before that there's no way that you're on a path of spiritual awakening if you're not also on a path of authenticity. Caring about living authentically isn't a stage or a phase in awakening, it's more like a layer of the ground or foundation that we need to walk on. So, while there's been a lot of talk about other dimensions of spiritual awakening, I think it's worth focusing more closely on this level or this frequency of authenticity because it's always going to be present. And, maybe we see ourselves as a bit more advanced on the path. We might take this aspect for granted or just overlook it because now it's so much of who we are. So in this video, I just want to cover like three aspects or central initiations really of the early stages of this path, the path of authenticity, and what you can expect. So it's a little bit longer, but so be sure to watch the end just to get all of this. But for those who are still a bit new or just, moving into a more spiritually awakened layer of consciousness, we may need a unique type of support because, in a way, this is a very dramatic transitional space. This is this crevasse, really, that separates social identity from your essential self. And this is really a more obstinate gap, I think, from the transition, for example, from, you're already living quite authentically and you're deepening this practice and you're deepening your integration that maybe proceeds a bit more in degrees, whereas this early stage, it's a larger gap. It's more dramatic. It's more of like you're leaping over an incommensurable paradigm. And so in that sense, it's a lot harder, I think, to begin this path. There are more obstacles. Um, okay, so I would really like to help you. If this is you and this is the space that you're in, I would like to help you through this transition by pointing out, again, a few observations or reminders that I think I've seen about what you can anticipate here. Okay, so first, let's figure out if this is actually you and if this is where you're at. So it may be a bit shocking, but not everyone actually cares about authenticity or even understands it. I've seen people who say they don't believe in it or they think it's a performance that some people put on. Like, so how's that for a self-explanatory breach of logic, right? I've talked about authenticity in some earlier videos, which you can watch. But essentially, if you already care about authenticity, like it's a core value, and along with other highly related values like the pursuit of truth, knowledge, and integrity, I think you're at least halfway or 1 foot on the path of spiritual advancement here. And in this stage, it's about authenticity, as I've said. So, how do you know if you're actually starting to walk and proceed on this path rather than, for example, just reading about it? Questioning is obviously a really central piece, but in my highly individuated estimate, I think that what really sets us apart as beginning to actually move on this path is when we really step into a willingness and an ability to effect change on ourselves, to create inner transformation rather than, not changing things in the outside world, but like the real work is within. Like, can you actually make that change with yourself? So, this is about moving yourself out of your conditioned programming in such a way that you're actually moving through the fears of the perspectival ego, dissolving this programming in order to follow the guidance of your higher self, your higher intuition. So it's that path of being able to move through the fear in order to affect the change on yourself, within yourself. Okay, and so this won't be an exhaustive list here, but these are three central issues that you're going to have to contend with if before we can get really far on this path. And I know this because I still have places where I'm working on aspects of these, and this part alone has already been like a 10-year journey. So if I summarize these really quickly, I would say these are isolation, intuition, and integration. And the thing that makes this crevasse I mentioned so deep and so apparently like incommensurable, it's such a big gap to jump. It's because there is such a real trade-off and such a real loss potentially that can occur when you move from socially conferred forms of power and you step into authentic empowerment. So you're not going to find authentic empowerment in socially conferred forms of power. And this is not to like negate their role or their necessity in certain contexts. It's just that they're not grounded in authenticity, and they can't be, because only an individual can find and define their own path of authenticity, because it's a path of individuation. It's inherently not social. And so there's a real subtlety here. It doesn't mean, for example, that, your pursuit of a career in law, for example, was inauthentic. It very well might have been at the time, from the basis of your own understanding and the context you were working with at that time. So these social structures and hierarchies, I kind of see them like, in a real sense, they're kind of like drawings on the sand at the beach, because with any new wave of consciousness that comes in, they can just be completely wiped out, and you kind of have to like redraw them in, or you've just moved on at that point. And what I mean by that is that there's actually several layers of truth to this. So we know social agreements are based on convention, which means they can flip at any time. They can change on you. You could be subject to new rules and standards. And related to that is the piece that within this paradigm, we're constantly in a place of needing to prove ourselves. External standards, external benchmarks and markers that aren't rooted in who we are, or within a locus of control a locus of power that we have control over. And so I've gone over this a lot in my videos on the matrix, which you can watch. And I explain what I mean by the matrix and how it's actually like a more accurate and pragmatic term than some people are probably willing to or able to acknowledge. Third, social functions of power don't actually see you qua your authentic self. They don't require that of people, or maybe I should say they don't or can't recognize that authenticity. And on top of that, it involves such messy stuff like psychic disintegration and rearrangement in order for an individual to make progress. And our social systems just don't really, like, they're not really that mature yet. So many of these roles, they just require that you like tick the boxes, so to speak, for fulfilling that part. And I don't mean that in a cynical or slanderous way. It's just, it's not just that it's like fake it till you make it. It's like a lot of it is, please keep on faking it. We need this. Nothing deeper is ever acknowledged, or it can't be. And so a large part of this trade-off or relinquishing of the social self, at least insofar as one is sourcing one's sense of power from that, is this theme of isolation. So a big part of the feeling of security we found in socially conferred forms of power is this sense of group belonging. And so once you turn and tune more in to focus on your own path of individuation, these forms of group identity and group belonging, or I should say group recognition, can't really follow you there. Or maybe I should say not at first. So these forms of group identity will naturally or by necessity begin to loosen. And this is a huge topic unto itself. But for example, you've heard that saying, be your most wild and crazy self, and then your people will find you. Well, make sure you're okay waiting, because that's not necessarily going to happen very quickly. And it's definitely not straightforwardly true. For example, part of this lesson with this initiation of authenticity is learning to stand alone. And so this goes back to our theme too of self-validation, which I've made some videos on, and finding our own roots so that we're just not so susceptible to the changing words and opinions of others, which again are grounded in these external and socially conferred networks of power. And so this is why this gap is so large here at the start of this path of authenticity, because standing alone with little external validation, or maybe with overt forms of criticism and active forms of negative projections, is quite uncomfortable at best. And we can't rely on someone else to say anymore, like we're doing the right thing, or nobody's clapping, or former friends and people who supported you are like strangely going quiet. So that's the whole essence of this part of the initiation, because we're learning to not rely on these external markers anymore, but rather an internal locus of understanding instead. And this brings us to the second large theme here, which is intuition. The further down our own path we go, the more we need to rely on this, in the sense of the discernment that I just talked about, but also in the sense of really unlocking other forms of knowledge or guidance that might arrive in unusual ways. Again, in ways that don't necessarily line up with social benchmarks. And so the thing with intuition, though, is that there are different levels of it, and you really have to learn to decode or be able to read your own language of intuition, like how it manifests for you. It's absolutely not as straightforwardly simple as follow your gut. That's completely unanalyzed. Higher level information about your purpose and your path is not going to come that way. Those networks are more attuned to information that can keep you safe. A lot of those networks are more based in, what we call like the lower chakra system, to use that vocabulary. So for example, if you're like driving like at 130 kilometers an hour on a 5-lane highway, and this has happened to me, where you start to get an impression about like the car in the next lane or right in front of you, and it's kind of like I don't like something here, I don't like that, and I'll instantly create space, I'll move to another lane. That's just how I don't even question that. That's what I'd call following your gut. That's information that's going to keep you safe, but it's not from your higher self. That's not really about your higher purpose. So if I had to really simplify this just based on my experience so far, I think that these gut level feelings are like they're more linked with the lower chakra system, and they create more of a sense of like pushing you away or keeping you away from someone or someplace. Whereas higher level information is going to feel more like being pulled towards something that is part of your path or your passion. And so the lesson here, again, is really about discernment, learning your own language of intuition, learning to read your own energetic field here, so to speak, so that you can properly act on different forms of intuition. So now let's move on to the third and final theme that we really encounter on this path of individuation. And this is a big one. This is integration. So in a real sense, this is the most challenging of these three, and it really requires that we have mastered much of the lessons or passed through most of the initiations of the other two, because integration is going to require that we're able to self-validate, we're able to stand alone and accurately discern and follow our own energy. We're going to need the help of intuitive knowledge even to achieve higher levels of integration, because at that level it's leaving behind existing forms of logic, existing logical frameworks, and the existing logic contained contradictions. That's why we were still fragmented. That's why things were still incommensurable and we had competing or conflicting ideas of self. So logic from that framework was never going to provide these links on its own. Now, what that level of logic is about is it's because it's filtered through social realities. Intuition itself contains logic, but like this is a whole other topic. It's just that at that level it's like a more pure and coherent form of logic, much larger than what I would call the baby logic, which is the way our social world works or operates on, is baby logic. Okay, so integration, though, also has several dimensions to it, and it's an ongoing process. So the mastery here in these early stages is really about like just finding your own method or finding your own program for doing this work so that it grows with you and can grow with your own awareness. So fundamentally, we have to integrate everything that's unconscious, whether this is in our shadow or if this is just aspects of new layers of awareness that we're moving into. And then we also have to integrate fragmented aspects of ourself, of our conscious selves, especially at this level. Most of us are still working with what I call competing programs of self. And this is the dimension that I really want to focus on first with you guys. What this refers to basically is that we live our daily life between different sets of habit loops, and they're governed by their own goals. And until we bring in massive levels of more awareness so that we can get all of these parts working together, all of these different states and drives, subordinate to a set of priorities about who we are that comes from our higher self. And with this concept of the higher self, you can also just think about this in terms of like, what are your highest values? What are your core values that you're always working towards? And that's kind of like a bridge for bringing in that level of information. So for example, maybe you're at work in the afternoon and you start making plans in your head about like the type of career you want to move into, what you need to do next for really moving into a better job, for example. And then as soon as you get home, you switch and you enter a new habit loop because now you're spending 4 hours like walking the dog, making dinner, maybe falling down from exhaustion and resting. And don't get me wrong, like we need to do certain things, but it's about moving through all of these routines without losing consciousness so that you can get right back to work and then you can actually like rewrite your resume before you call it a night. That's one example. And then another one is when we have two competing sets of programs, they're both things we need to do. These are both really core central forms of our self-development, but they conflict or they need to be modulated in the short term. So, for example, your exercise routine, and at the same time, you're also taking a course or program that's really going to advance you, and you have to find a way to not just balance these, but you may actually have to like really dial down on the exercise in order to achieve the other one. This is also a type of integration. So again, this is really just scratching the surface of the topic, but I think you can see my point. It was really clarifying for me when I finally did learn about competing programs of self, and not just competing, but even some that actually conflict. And it's deeper than daily habits. You know, we can have goals and desires that are like literally conflicting with one another, and in a healthy or strong process of individuation, we find a way to make decisions or prioritize which goals will support other goals and which plans or ideas about ourselves will really take precedence. And so here, when I was thinking about this, I really got an image of the approach to a black hole. So if you've seen any of these simulations, it's that as you approach it, like the black hole is getting larger, and the perspectival views of time space are in fact shrinking, like they're collapsing around the black hole. And if you think about this as the center of our awareness, as it grows or as we approach it, it's like all the other accidents of our self kind of have to like shrink or fall or collapse around this expanding perception, which is like this expanding point of presence, if that makes sense. So no wonder that can feel so frightening from the limited egoic perspective, if that makes any sense. If that metaphor resonates with you, it definitely does with me. So I'm just going to stop here for now because this is already pretty complex, but I would really love to hear from you, your reactions, if this raised any questions for you. And yeah, so I will hear from you in the comments.